What's up, everyone? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Stochastic channel. Today, we're talking some college football DFS ahead of the Week 10 main slate. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. We are also brought to you by Bet365. They have a deal where you can bet $5 in any game, side, total, doesn't matter. Whether it wins or loses, you are getting $200 in the form of bet credits. And right now, we have this very special link join page. So you can take advantage of that promo and get a month of our sims, any sport you want, you're choosing. This includes Bet365 among a number of our other partners. So that means if you click this link, you're still getting those $200 in bonus bets, regardless of whether it wins or loses. But you also get one free month of the sims, any sport. All you have to do is follow these instructions here. Best part about this, if you want to stack multiple months, all you have to do is sign up with multiple partners. I can't believe this is actually a deal that is offered right now. I can guarantee you it will not be around forever. And it's the best way to take advantage of our sims for a cheap price. Gives you access to more books, more partners, more months of free data that's just provided to you. Check it out. The links are below. All right. Big slate. As usual, we will go through the main slate on DraftKings, followed by FanDuel. I will bring you behind the glass. We'll talk some player data stuff. And let's see where I'm on the middle of this slate on accident. Excuse me. Wow, we're kicking it off with a real barn burner. Air Force taking on Army. An interesting addition to the slate. Normally, we only get the Armed Force Academies on weekdays. They're a lone weekend when Army plays Navy, or if one of the teams is really good. In this case, Army's undefeated, but Air Force is atrocious. The spread is 21.5 points. There's an injury on Air Force. Their only usable player, Quentin Hayes, is questionable for this game. He didn't play in their last contest, which renders them completely useless. Don't play anyone on Air Force. They have a lot of guys that are banged up and haven't played in a while. Aiden Calvert, Roman Bradley. I mean, we just don't know who's even going to be on the field on top of them having a 9.5 team total. I'll waste no more of your time. For Army, Bryson Daly has a pretty ridiculous role. It is somewhat dependent on this remaining competitive. If you can see on the screen, he had 33 carries in their last game. That's more than the prior two games combined, but it requires a competent opponent, which I'm not really sure Air Force is. Their Army's a 21.5 point favorite, for the love of God. I mean, come on. Other than that, Kanye Udo is somewhat interesting. He had 19 carries last game, 17 the game prior. I think you actually can consider him. Normally, Armed Forces are X-out teams or light considerations on main slates, but I mean, they're playing Air Force, who's allowing 5.3 yards per carry. So Udo, I think, is fine. I tentatively would rather play him than Daly. The only real wrinkle here is Tyrell Robinson did return from injury. He's not a fullback. He plays the slapback position. So I'm not really expecting him to play a ton. If he does, it doesn't really come at Udo's expense either. And then you're not playing receivers, especially in non-competitive games for Army. Memphis, UTSA, 7-point spread in favor of the road team. Memphis, the total in the game is 61 points. Interesting game. Memphis has a very strong matchup through the air, which is concerning for UTSA, considering they're allowing 9.1 yards per attempt, and Memphis throws the ball 54.5% of the time. Seth Hennigan, 38 attempts per game, not running as much as he typically does, but I think he's still completely fine to get to at 7,600. Good in this middle range. They have an awesome team total, and this is a lot of back and forth appeal. In the backfield, you're going to have to watch injuries. Greg DeRosier warmed up in their last game, didn't play, and Brandon Thomas also missed. They lost Sutton Smith way earlier in the year to a season ender. So the statuses of DeRosier and Brandon Thomas loom large because without them, Mario Anderson had a 32 carry game in their last contest. I don't think that's likely. I do believe we see DeRosier, and I do think we maybe see Thomas. If that's the case, he's virtually unplayable at 7,800. He's priced as if he's going to touch the ball 25 plus times, and we have a pretty decent sample of him below that when they have other backs available. So he's not my favorite spend up. At receiver, Rock Taylor, Demir Blankenship, Kobe Drake are very clearly the most involved players on this team, followed by tight end Anthony Landfier, who is a decent role. I do think these players are somewhat viable, especially Kobe Drake at a 3,500 price tag. If you're just going to talk about someone who could be a value on this slate, a lot of people just ask for who are the value guys? Who are the value guys? This is one option. His route share has been very clearly above 80% last 2 games. Same thing with Rock Taylor and Demir Blankenship. You're just foregoing some targets. But it's 5.3 per game for him compared to like 5.9 for Blankenship, 7.6 for Taylor. So I think by far he is the best price-adjusted option, Blankenship being the worst, Rock Taylor pretty efficient. Landfier, I guess if you want to get there, he's rotating more tight end snaps than normal with Brendan Doyle. And when they go 4 wide, it's Jair shorter, but he's pre-capped around 30% of the routes. On the other side, UTSA, Owen McCown is pretty bad. He's actually in a similar range, just basically all counting stats, 38 attempts per game, 259 yards. That's almost identical to Seth Hennigan. Rushing yards, Hennigan 85, Owen McCown 62. So if you want to just make the argument that, okay, they basically have the same exact counting stats, why are we playing Hennigan over McCown? I could understand that. The real difference is the implied team total for these 2 teams, with Memphis being ahead. But honestly, McCown is probably going to be a decent price-adjusted quarterback on this slate, even though I don't think he's any good. So that's at least worth mentioning. He's at a price point where I think we need to at least talk about him. I don't know how much I'm going to play. In the backfield, Rocco Griffin hit the portal, which kind of has rendered this a 2-way committee. Their last game wasn't super competitive, but they have involved a third back through multiple points this season. Last game, instead of using Brandon High, which they had done previously, they gave Bryson Donnell, the Texas Tech transfer, a few carries. I don't really care who it is. It just siphons off some carries from the lead backs, which are Kavorian Barnes and Robert Henry. Kavorian Barnes is coming off a 10-carry game, Henry coming off a 20-carry game. That's just the kind of split we're going to see regardless. Now, if UTSA is winning, they'll be closer to this 20-10 split. If they're losing, it might be closer to this 10-5. So I don't have a ton of interest in the UTSA backs, especially when you consider they use a third back. No matter who it is, there will be one on the field. At wide receiver, this is an absolute mess. This team tried to bring back DeCorian Clark. He tore his ACL again. I believe it's the other ACL. Devin McEwen hasn't played in 2 weeks. We've seen DJ Allen miss the last 2 games, and they lost their tight end Oscar Cardenas in their last game. So who does that leave? I think it is actually a little more clear than normal. The top 2 receivers should be Willie McCoy and Chris Carpenter. They're another 2 value plays. They each are coming off 10 target games. Carpenter's been in double digits each of the last 2 and above 7 in each of the last 4. McCoy hasn't been below 7 either. And then you actually get pretty solid tight end snaps out of Houston Thomas. He also had a 10-target game. So I actually have a little more interest in UTSA than normal, and it's just because everybody's hurt for this team. Thomas saw his route share jump to 70% in the last game. Outside of that, they're using more 12 personnel than ever because of the injuries. We just saw Dan Dishman and Patrick Overmeyer with 50% of the routes. That was in addition to what we saw from Houston Thomas at 70. They just don't have a lot of receivers on this team anymore, so I don't think this is going to change. J.J. Sparkman and Jace Wilson at 25% of the routes apiece. So there's not really a wide receiver 3. And, man, Houston Thomas at 3K flat is somewhat interesting. I mean, he's averaging 6.5 targets over the last 4 games. Ole Miss, Arkansas, 7.5-point spread, 53.5 total. Pretty fast game. Mississippi, 6th in pace. Arkansas, 45th. Pass rate, 47-ish% for both teams, little north of that. Dart's at 9,300. Pretty exorbitant price tag. He's averaging 336 through the air. That's all because their non-con was a cupcake schedule. 207 rushing yards. Dart has a ceiling. He hasn't shown it quite as often recently, but Arkansas's defense does have some questions, especially in the back end. They are healthier now than they have been through a lot of points in the season, but Dart never really projects all that well. He's kind of just, if you have the luxury of getting up to him, you can play him if you want, or if you want him to be your contrarian piece, so be it. But there's a reason I don't love him today, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. It's at the receiver. Running back Matt Jones is questionable for this game. If they get him back, I think he basically just splits with Ulysses Bentley, who's just exactly taking what Matt Jones was giving them prior. Henry Parrish is averaging 17.4 touches per game. That hasn't really changed, whether it's been Matt Jones or Ulysses Bentley. I know some people were really excited about Bentley for some reason. I really cannot tell you why. He hasn't really been that good ever in his career. But people seem to think he is. Anyway, what actually has happened on the field, regardless of people's opinions, is that Bentley and Jones have been change of pace works. Parrish has been the lead back. JJ Pegues, all of these plays are basically touchdowns. He is a defensive tackle. He comes on the field once in a while, and he just scores touchdowns. So that hurts Parrish. He'll still project decently because the efficiency's there, and he catches passes pretty well. Our receiver, Trey Harris, is questionable. This will be a huge pivot point on the slate. Without him, you're going to see Caden Lee, Antwine Wells, and Jordan Watkins operate as the 1-2-3. Watkins had the best route share, and I did not quite expect this to be the case, but it was. He was up at 95%. Wells was at 83%. Lee was at 77%. At tight end, another surprising thing for me was Caden Prieskorn jumping from 33% of the routes up to 86%. Now, Daquan Wright was a little banged up in the game. His routes dropped from 65 to 40%. That has ebbed and flowed a little bit. And as you can see, they use more 12 personnel than they typically do. But I think you are running into a pretty predictable target totem pole. When Trey Harris is out, I would slightly lean Watkins 1, Wells 2, Lee 3. But Lee did come into the game with an injury. So perhaps I'm discounting him a little bit. Regardless, none of them are expensive, so it makes Dart actually a little more interesting. You can stack him with ease in this game when you have to play Trey Harris, who soaks up. I mean, he has over 30% of the targets when healthy. That makes things a little trickier. So I'm actually talking myself into a little Ole Miss if Trey Harris is out. We'll see on his status. Arkansas, we have Taylon Green, who's kind of breaking some slates. His efficiency has been pretty decent as a passer. He went through a little midseason slump after previously annihilating their non-conference, and now he's played a little bit better of late. Averaging 257 through the air, 395 on the ground. Those are great numbers. Ole Miss's defense is very good. They're one of the best defenses in the country, so it won't be easy sledding for him, and this offensive line is putrid. But I think this is a reasonable price tag. I will have some interest in him despite being a touchdown underdog. In the backfield, looking at a committee, Jaquindon Jackson's out. We saw Braylon Russell and Rashad Dubinian handle most of the work. And Rodney Hill's also been banged up. He could return here. If he's back, I don't know what this committee looks like, but I don't have a ton of interest to begin with. At receiver, Andrew Armstrong has a 30% target share, so he's just naturally going to be interesting even as a contrarian pivot. Without that, they've kind of rotated receivers. Satina's gotten more involved. Tesla's gotten more involved. Broden has really kind of remained the same at his 3.5 targets per game, gone down a little bit. And Luke Haas is not playing the role we thought he was going to. Actually hit some unders on his props. His route share has been horrible this year. Can't really tell you why, but last game he was at 39%. And maybe it's just they're using a little more 4 wide. But the only thing to really mention here is they did have a couple tight ends retire or, I don't know, quit the team. Call it what you want, but Ty Washington and Varkey's Gums are gone. They weren't playing anyway, so who cares? But they did get back Andre Posky, which is honestly probably worse for Luke Haas because he actually plays when he's healthy, whereas Varkey's Gums and Ty Washington are a bunch of bozos. Duke, Miami. This game has a 54.5 total. Miami, 20.5 point favorite. Duke is 33rd in pace with a 52% pass rate. Miami is 100th in pace with a 54.3% pass rate. They're very explosive. Duke has run hotter than the sun to get to where we are, and now you're not sneaking anything by the bookmakers here. They're nearly 3 touchdown underdogs. Malik Murphy's unplayable. You would need to give me salary to play him. Jaquez Moore is going to come back at some point, allegedly. He's been in practice, but he still hasn't played. Regardless, like Duke needs to be winning games for them to see like this kind of split. Right now, Star Thomas, 20 touches per game. Peyton Jones, 7.5. But we've seen that as low as 14 and 5 in their third most recent game. I mean, this team is probably going to get slaughtered. No real interest in the Duke backs. And at receiver, Jordan Moore has still yet to play his full allotment of snaps after undergoing some sort of midseason injury. He's coming back slowly, and I just can't tell you that he's 100% right now. His routes most recently, 21%, 55%. And concerningly, the 20% game was after their bye. That's led to more Eli Pankel, Samir Hagan's pretty consistent, and then they're rotating that wide receiver 3 spot between Javon Harvey, Keyshawn Brown. It's kind of just a mess for Duke across the board. Eli Pankel or pass, and it will be a pass for me. I will likely have 0 Duke in any of my lineups. Cam Ward, very, very expensive on this slate, 186 rushing yards per game. He's regressed, which was predictable. This guy has never been a premier rusher. He can scramble and give you some yards, but he's not giving you a ton. Efficiency could be there. Duke has played good pass defense. They've also have played nothing but horrible quarterbacks through most of the season. And even Kevin Jennings last week, despite the turnovers, got there. So I still have questions with the Duke secondary. Cam Ward is another one of these luxury plays. If you can find your way up there, I'm never going to have a problem with some contrarian Miami stacks. There are ways to play it that are cheap, though. I'll skip over running back for a second. Restrepo is the only expensive guy, and I don't think he's going to project that well. 8.5 targets per game over the last 4, above 7.5 in the season. You just find guys with better target shares, and yeah, their implied team total is high, touchdown equity is better, efficiency is better. But I mean, he has like the same target numbers as the UTSA receivers. So it's just like a hard click up there with the target numbers not being there. If this was Trey Harris or Ty Felton or something, sure, but I don't know. I'll likely have some because I'll likely play some Ward, but who knows? Outside of this, Miami's routes have been pretty inconsistent, so I'll defer to the target share. I think Horton is just fine if you want to get to him here. And then Jacoby George, Sam Brown, they're closer on the year. 5.4 targets for George, 5.3 for Brown. Brown has a little more explosive ability, I think, than George, just based on his background. But it's still very close. Overall, you look at the routes, the only one who's above 80% every game is Restrepo. Last game, Horton, 74. That was a season high. Jacoby George, 65%. That tied a season high, aside from week 1. And then Sam Brown, 47%. That was a season low. I don't have any faith that this remains consistent. Who knows? Elijah Arroyo also was at 58% of the routes. That was his 3rd lowest mark of the year. He's just splitting a little time here and there. Whether it's Cam McCormick, Elijah Lofton, the freshman, or Riley Williams, like some of these guys come out there once in a while. The backfield is a complete 50-50 timeshare now. Damian Martinez has played himself right out of the lead back role, and perhaps he's had a couple good games recently. Perhaps he just needed Mark Flesher to light a fire under him because he was pretty bad to start the year. Likely not playing a Miami back. Maybe you could talk me into Fletcher at 4K. This is pretty consistent now. I mean, over the last 3 games, these guys have the same amount of carries. I don't know. Fletcher, somewhat interesting. I don't think he's going to be as involved in the receiving game, but you could do worse than him, I guess. Minnesota, Illinois. 3-point spread in favor of Minnesota, 45.5 total. Pretty bad game. Slow game. Minnesota 112th in pace, Illinois 81st. And pass rates. I don't know what Minnesota's doing, but they're throwing the ball 53% of the time. Illinois is at 47%. That's a little more appropriate. Brosmer, 31 attempts per game, 218 yards, negative rushing yards. You just can't really play him. Darius Taylor, he has 1 25-carry game within their last 3. A lot of weird, noisy games in there. Marcus Major does play a change of pace role, but honestly, Taylor's pass game role is so good that I don't really think it matters. The carries are down, but honestly, his role might be better. He hasn't seen fewer than 4 targets in any of the last 4 games. He has a 13-target game in there. He's averaging 5.7 targets per game on the year and 36.5 receiving yards. Taylor is just fine, in my opinion, even though the carries have gone down. His pass game role is awesome. He's the 2nd most targeted player on the team behind Daniel Jackson, who is absurdly has a 32% target share. I incorrectly made the mistake of downward boosting him last week. He had 12 targets in an awesome game. He has at least 12 targets in each of the last 2, at least 9 in 3 of the last 4. I don't know if you really want to play a secondary receiver, though. It's either Elijah Spencer or Lameek Brockington. They're on the field the most. Jameson Gears at tight end, but it's just I'm not paying $3,800 for Brockington or $4K for Spencer when you have like the UTSA guys who get like 7 targets a game, and you're paying for 1 to 3 for these bad Minnesota receivers. Luke Altmaier finally saw some of his turnover-worthy plays converted to interceptions, whereas he had been the luckiest quarterback in the country in that regard with his interceptable passes getting dropped by defenders, and then they got slaughtered. But I'm not really sure you can play a lot of Altmaier. I will say I have a little more interest in him compared to Brosmer because he runs. He's 136. Now, he doesn't run a lot, but Brosmer is going to give you likely negative yards. Luke Altmaier might give you, 20 on the ground. Efficiency is really bad for him. Pat Bryant's hurt. He has a concussion. Bielema seems to think Bryant's going to play. I don't know. He's like, I can't remember what he said. Something like, it would be a miracle if he missed this game or something along the lines of like, Pat Bryant's a warrior. He's going to play through it as if Pat Bryant has any control over whether the independent neurologist clear. I'm like, what a moron. Anyway, if Bryant's out, that would be a huge ding for Altmaier. I guess the only real consideration at receiver I have is Zachary Franklin at 4,200. I don't understand why Zachary Franklin isn't more expensive, at least narrow the price gap between these two guys. Yeah, Pat Bryant's been more efficient, but it's pretty clearly that Zachary Franklin's targeted more often. And yeah, that last game needs to be taken into account. But even before then, it was pretty clearly Zachary ahead of him. Backfield's a committee. We saw Lahiri outplay McCray. Khalil Valentine got back involved. I'd pass on Illinois running backs. Ohio State, Penn State. 3-point spread in favor of Ohio State, 46.5 total. Slow game, Ohio State 106, Penn State 117th. That's pace. Ohio State 47% pass rate, Penn State 42. Starting with Ohio State, Will Howard has been kind of rendered a game manager. He's not running anymore. He has 91 rushing yards this year, 255 through the air, which is still pretty good. But the offense has had a surprising amount of inefficiency. I don't know what to make of that. I'll always play a little bit of Howard for the upside with his explosive offense, but this is just a horrible game to really play anyone. So Howard is definitely going to be a player to avoid in most lineups. He would be a contrarian piece that you could maybe click on in some of the larger fields. And you have Ohio State with two running backs splitting the work 50-50, and their workloads have been really bad this year. 12.7 touches for Quinshon Judkins, 10.1 for Henderson. Unfortunately, this hasn't gotten any better in competitive games, so it's just like they're both significantly overpriced. They should both be about $2K cheaper than they are, maybe $1.5K cheaper than they are. Outside of big tournaments, pass. At receiver, just give me Emeka Ibuka for $700 cheaper than Jeremiah Smith. I love Jeremiah Smith, but you're getting more targets with Ibuka pretty clearly. He has double-digit targets in 3 of the last 4 games. Jeremiah Smith has done that in 1 of the last 4. And Cardinal Tate is very cheap. He has an 11.5% target share. But if you just wanted a cheap attachment to Ohio State, I think you could go to him. G. Scott played a massive role in their last game. He was above 85% of the routes, but they didn't have Will Kasmerick. Not that Kasmerick plays a lot, but I think that kind of just solidified G. Scott's role for 1 game. They actually had a 95% route share. And the last thing with Ohio State, in their most recent contest, they played Ibuka, Smith, and Tate 100% of the snaps, all 3. No other receiver saw a snap. That is firmly in the range of outcomes in this game against Penn State. Drew Aller is questionable. I think it's a knee injury, so his mobility should be called into question. If Pribula starts, you could look to him as a contrarian piece at 6,500 because he's extremely mobile. Questions with the arm, but I don't really think you want to play any Penn State guys. The offense is so slow. They're so gimmicky. They'll come in with a good game plan if Aller can't play, but I don't really know if it leads to DFS success. Backfield is copy and paste what Ohio State has. Insert that analysis for Penn State. The only difference is Katrin Allen is much cheaper, so I don't know. Maybe you could throw him in as a dart. Don't love it, though, especially against Ohio State's front. Receiver, it's basically Tyler Warner pass. He's now 7,100. I mean, just give me a break with this price tag. Otherwise, they finally threw Julian Fleming to the Wolves, benched him, which was deserved. He's horrible. He had a 46% route rate, and after some more drops, he hit the bench. That was the season low for him. And I'll tell you this, it should be lower. This guy sucks. So that led to more routes for Harrison Wallace, Omari Evans, and Liam Clifford. Wallace was by far the route leader among receivers. I don't know if you can really trust any of these guys. Wallace would be interesting as maybe a contrarian dart at 3,900, but this entire game is pretty bad for DFS. The best real-life game, but, I mean, it's just really hard to make any stands on a 46.5 total. Florida, Georgia, 14.5-point spread in favor of the Bulldogs. Florida's taken a ton of money, including mine. 51.5 total here. It's going to be hard to play anyone on Florida for DFS. Lagway is in at QB. Actually, you know what? I hadn't seen these prices. Lagway is 4,800. He can run a little bit, 56 yards on the ground this year. That's more the product of Mertz playing most of the season. He's out now, obviously. And Lagway has great efficiency. He's averaging nearly first on every time he drops back. It's just he hasn't dropped back a lot. At running back, I don't know if we see Montrell Johnson. He missed their last game. He's questionable here. Without him, Jaden Baugh carried 22 times. Jacoby Jackson carried 9 times, and even Cam Carroll came in the game for 3. Tryon Webb's also out, so this could be the split again. There hasn't really been anything to suggest otherwise. Not really interested, though. I mean, there's it's open plus 17, and now it's getting down close to plus 14. But still, 2 touchdown underdog. I don't know if I have an interest in a Florida back. Receiver, I do have some interest. We did see Eugene Wilson out again. So that should open up Badger and DK as the top 2 receivers yet again. They weren't super productive in his stead, but, they're extremely cheap. My biggest question, I guess, here is what does Florida do with their wide receiver 3? Because those weren't the only receivers out when we lost Wilson for the first time. Mizell's gotten a chance to play for this offense. I think he could be the primary candidate for the wide receiver 3. You also have Jaquavian Frazier's back in the fold. He could be a candidate for wide receiver 3. Marcus Burke previously played this role. I think he should be back. Tank Hawkins is a guy they've used as like a situational ball carrier. He had a game with a 68% route share this year. My bet is some combination of Mizell and Hawkins being the top 2. Frazier 3, I would rank Burke 3rd, fourth. But I don't feel good about that ranking for the Florida wide receiver 3 position. And maybe you just avoid it as 2 touchdown underdogs. Like, what are we really, especially with DK and Badger being cheap, like, why would you gamble on that? Boardingham doesn't have the role you think he does. They'll use multiple tight ends at his expense. Georgia Carson Beck is 7,900. He's averaging 285 per game. They have a good team total, 33 points. Florida is somewhat susceptible to the pass, 7.8 yards per attempt. I think you could play a contrarian back. I don't really have a lot of problems with it. I don't think I would consider him for cash, though. At running back, Trevor Etienne has an awesome workload, 17.2 touches per game. They've limited him in complete blowout spots. I'm not really worried about his workload. They also have injuries to both of the Robinsons, and then that kind of just leaves Nate Frazier, the freshman, to handle work. Wide receiver, Colby Young, obviously suspended. That leaves Dominic Lovett, Arian Smith, and Dylan Bell as the 3 primary receivers, which I think you can bank on with pretty good certainty at this point. The only other player who gets a somewhat decent amount of routes is London Humphreys, and he was at 33% last game, which left us Dominic Lovett, Arian Smith, both at 77, Dylan Bell at 91. Pretty good route rates for those 3 guys. Tight end is a disaster. It's Delp, Lucky, and Jurasic. I don't know why he came here. He's barely playing, but those guys are all cannibalizing each other. I think you pretty clearly just want to play these top 3 guys. If you're playing Georgia, that is. I don't think they're awesome plays, but they're in play. Arizona UCF, 6-point spread in favor of the home team. Arizona's got to go across the country to the bounce house. 55.5 total. Pace is good. Arizona 60th, UCF 18th. Brent Brennan showing his true colors as an absolute dolt head coach. And Jed Fish showing his colors as a good one. Noah Fafita has been a pretty big disaster this year. Everything he did well last year, he's doing the exact opposite. He's basically turned into Jaden Delore reincarnated with his turnovers. And he can't run, and it's not all his fault. He has a bad offensive line and no good receivers outside of Ted McMillan. This is a laughable price tag on him. I'm just not sure what is going on, why Fafita would be this expensive. He should be 6,300, and even then, I don't think I'd play him. In the backfield, I took an under on Quayle Conley's rushing prop. He had 16 carries in the last game. He's averaging 17.1. But that was before the emergence of Kedrick Reese-Cano, the former 4-star Ole Miss transfer, who's taking a decent amount of the carries right now, as well as some targets out of the backfield. He plays enough that I think it hurts Conley, and you don't really want to play him. Do you play Ted McMillan? I think you absolutely can. I would be nervous because in the last 4 games, he has 15, 8, 5, 14 targets. Do you really want to sink 8,600 into the potential to get a 5-target game? Part of the reason he's seeing these 5-target games is defenses are just absolutely dedicating extra coverage to him. All the other receivers on this team are pure ass. This might be the worst P4 receiving program in the country outside. If you remove Ted McMillan, obviously it's better than the worst. It's probably actually like pretty good overall because Ted's there. Without him, these guys, you might as well just get as many tight ends as you can on the field, play multiple running backs. Hell, play a sixth offensive lineman. Because this unit is utterly atrocious. Montana Lamonius Craig finally hit the bench, 21% route share for him last game. About time. Like, can't wait to see him at Grambling State next year. Chris Hunter jumped up to 92%, didn't matter. Jeremiah Patterson remained pretty consistent, 66%, didn't matter. This team sucks, man. Like, they're just so bad at throwing the ball. As long as UCF's new DC, they fired their DC this week, watches any sort of film and realizes Ted McMillan is an All-American and takes him away. Once you take away Ted, you take away the Arizona offense, and they're absolutely cooked. UCF, we don't know who's playing quarterback. They benched KJ Jefferson. Apparently, there is no plan to ever get him back involved. They started Ja'Cory Brown. He has been atrocious as a passer. I don't think it's all his fault. We talked about this last week. With him, he was either throwing go balls or he was running the ball himself. That hasn't really changed a lot. The offense is very difficult. With that said, he still played poorly, and they brought in Dylan Rizek at the end of the game, and he had a nice drive. So they might start Rizek here. He did rush a little bit. He's 4,500, the Stone Man. You're going to need confirmation on this, but if Rizek starts, he'll certainly be in play, and he might even be in like cash game builds. I haven't finished all the projections yet, and I'm pretty sure I have Ja'Cory Brown starting. I can't remember. But I mean, at this price tag, that would allow you to get up to some of the more expensive guys on the slate that we do have interest in. Maybe you play like Cam Ward and Dylan Rizek. They're still favored. They have a 31 team total. And I guess probably the real consideration here is just RJ Harvey. Trim some more fat with the offense. The dusty old Penny Boone, who people thought was somehow going to have success here, as if he didn't originally play at a P4 program, and then he was so bad he had to transfer to Toledo, and he was good at Toledo. I mean, what were you expecting, thinking Penny Boone was going to do anything? Anyway, RJ Harvey, 20.5 touches per game. He's averaging 127 rush yards. And when they throw the ball, he's on the field. They're running a super run-heavy offense right now, even run heavier than this 38% pass rate right now because of their backup signal callers. But he is awesome. Arizona's team is so bad, like he should have at least this 127 yards, if not more. Kobe Hudson got hurt. He couldn't put any weight on his legs. I highly doubt we see him. They also benched the dusty Trent Whitmore, who is despite playing, he has a near 60% route share. He's only able to earn 7 targets. So what did that do? It condensed the routes around Jacoby Jones, Javaris Johnson, and Chauncey Magwood. I don't think any of them are super playable because this offense is so run heavy. Probably the best guy to play is just Pittman at tight end. Even that, pretty dicey with this team never throwing the ball. Kansas State, Houston. 13-point spread in favor of Kansas State, 46 total. Kansas State still is interesting despite the total being so low and the pace being really bad. Kansas State 93rd in seconds per play. Houston 125th. Pass rate low for both teams. There could be efficiency here for Avery Johnson. I will say Houston's played a little better of late, but Johnson gives you strong dual threat ability. His floor-ceiling combo is pretty high, especially if Houston keeps it close, which they had done more of late. I don't really understand why. They are well coached, I think. So you kind of need them to fight back for Avery Johnson to achieve a ceiling, but I think that could happen. DJ Giddens is a very good price-adjusted play. He's averaging 118 rush yards per game, another 25 through the air. He's only 7,600. What in the world are we doing with this price tag? You can certainly play him. And then at receiver, we have seen more routes for Keegan Johnson. It's actually been fairly condensed of late between Jace Brown and Keegan Johnson. I think both these guys are pretty solid options. And then wide receiver 3, little more rotating. Jaden Jackson actually did see a season high 72% of the routes at the expense of Dante Cephas. I'd like to see that for more than one game before buying in. Tight end's a disaster, especially with Braden Lofton back. I don't have a ton of interest in the Kansas State pass catchers. It's kind of just Giddens, best play, Avery, decent play, receivers only in stacks. Zeon Chris started their last game. He's actually played a decent amount of time now. He just played so poorly as a passer. I fear he'll get benched at any time as well. Leash has been really bad for the Houston QBs. He is more mobile than Smith, so I'm not going to play him, but if you did want to be really contrarian, I guess. Parker Jenkins could be back in this game. That might render the backfield pretty dicey, especially when you had Zeon Chris leading the team in design carries, 17 to Rashawn Sanford, the freshman, 16. But Jamarian Burnett and Stacey Seed were still involved. That was a game they won against Utah. We see what this looks like when they lose. I mean, this could get gross fast. Not playing a Houston back. All of their receivers rotated. And I don't think you're going to see anyone above like a 60% route share. Houston is a team that I am fully comfortable just Xing out. Texas Tech, Iowa State, 13.5 point spread in favor of the Cyclones, 56.5 total. I don't know where pace is going to come in. Texas Tech plays fast. They're 30th. Iowa State is slow, 1-0 first. Texas Tech, 53.5% pass rate. Baron Morton allegedly pretty healthy. If you think he gets through this game, I think he's a decent play. The team total here is low. He doesn't run, but he's playing in an air raid offense. And Iowa State is semi-untested this year. They have a weaker schedule. Not my favorite play, but in play. What they've really done of late, too, is just ride Taj Brooks straight into the ground. He's now averaging nearly 28 touches per game, 131.5 rushing yards, only 5.4 through the air, but his route share is like up above 50% in most games, 7 targets in the last 2. That's a combined number. You can certainly play Taj Brooks. Iowa State still has a ton of linebackers out. At receiver, Josh Kelly played a lot less in the last game, and I'm not sure why. I was trying to parse whether he was injured. Nothing's been reported. But his route share did drop to 67%. That was by far a season low outside of week 3, which I believe was an FCS game. Then they had Caleb Douglas jump to 77. Coy Eakin jumped to 86. Everything else was a nasty, nasty rotation. So I still think it's pretty clearly just Kelly, Eakin, or Douglas. But that gives me more interest in paying down for Eakin and Douglas versus up for Josh Kelly. The targets are just still so good for Kelly that it might not matter. Iowa State, Rocco Becht is the exact same price as Baron Morton. Their stats aren't all that different other than Rocco's been more efficient, so similar yardage and less volume. 244.5 passing yards per game on 29.5 attempts, 162 rushing yards. That's certainly better than Morton and probably gives him a similar projection. Carson Hansen was injured in their last game, so we saw more carries go to Abu Sama, who shockingly led the backfield in carries after only seeing 2 the week prior. Jalen Jackson is still very involved. I think this is still likely to be Hansen 1, Jalen Jackson 2, Sama 3, but still fairly close between these guys. I don't have a lot of interest in the Iowa State backs. Maybe you'll get some as a salary saver in sprinklings of lineups. At receiver, it's very clearly Jaden Higgins, Jalen Noel. You can play them both. They are combining for 62% of the targets. Ben Brahmer got hurt in their last game. He is still a pretty distant number 3 receiver for this team. He plays tight end. 8.5% target share for Brahmer. I'd rather just play a different value guy. Like, I don't know. Find your way over to Coy Eakin. Find your way over to someone else who's very cheap. Play a min-price UTSA guy. At wide receiver 3, it's been mostly Carson Brown of late, but they still rotate. Not a ton of interest. All right. Indiana, Michigan State, 7.5 point spread in favor of Indiana. Michigan State, the underdog, 53.5 total. Slow pace, Indiana, 87th. Michigan State, 124th. Rourke is back. Rourke doesn't run a lot, but he does average 277 through the air. That includes a game he missed about a half, where David Jackson took over because of the thumb injury. I think he's okay. He's not going to be a standout price-adjusted play by any means, but they've been so efficient that I think you could get to some Rourke. Backfield's a little bit of the hot hand. In the last 4 games, we've seen Lawton and Ellison lead it. I will say Ellison carrying 29 times should inspire some confidence at 5,200. I think he's a fine GPP play. And then at receiver, Elijah Surratt is the main guy who's on the field most of the time for this Indiana team. They rotate a little bit, even with some of their departures via the transfer portal. But if you want to get someone beyond Surratt, Omar Cooper, 74% of the routes. Miles Price, 53. Miles Cross, 74. Keyshawn Williams, 37. Zach Horton, the tight end, 47. Then we get into some of the receivers. So as you can see, it is very spread around. That is a consistent trend. It is Surratt, and then everyone else, I think, is in dart throw territory. But you could look at some players like Cross, 3,400. What of it? Michigan State, Aiden Childs actually has pretty solid efficiency numbers if you were to remove turnover-worthy plays, where he leads the country in both frequency and raw turnover-worthy plays. He just, for every good play he makes, he has at least one dumb one. Stats are really bad for him. just counting stats. Offense is super slow. They only have a 48% pass rate, which is pretty balanced, but 172 rushing yards doesn't make up for it. 5K is semi-enticing, but I mean, I think it's a really tough click on Childs. Backfield, we're seeing more of the hot hand between Carroll Lynch Adams and Nate Carter. I don't have any interest here. The player I do have some interest in is Nick Marsh. This guy has like a 95% route share last 2 games. He's leading the team in targets in that span. The only problem, I guess, is that he did come in more expensive than Monterey Foster, who's right there as well. These guys are very clearly the top 2 receivers. I think I would rank Velling 3rd at tight end, and then their 4th is probably, I don't know if this is going to be consistent. They benched Jerron Glover, kind of. Isaiah Johnson, 46% of the routes. Alante Brown came back, 5%. Maybe he plays more. I think you just very clearly want to play Marsh or Monterey Foster in this offense, if you're playing anyone. And I think they're cheap enough where you can certainly consider that. Oregon, Michigan, 14.5-point spread in favor of Oregon, 45 total. We've seen Michigan really give it up. Will Johnson's still banged up. We're not sure if he plays in this game. I wouldn't be surprised if this goes over the total just on efficiency on the Oregon side. I'm considering stuff like team total over for them. But anyway, 47% pass, they're 86th in pace. Michigan is 131st in pace with a 40% pass rate. Gabriel, despite having one of the lowest 8-outs in the country, is towards the top in YPA. His efficiency and what his receivers are doing are just next level. He is not running a lot this year, but he's still averaging nearly 300 yards. You can always play Gabriel. James has been the victim of blowouts. It is what it is. When Oregon blows teams out, James is not going to carry the ball 20-plus times. Whittington will be involved. Jalen Lamar had 7 carries. DeJuan Ruggs had 5. I mean, Illinois was lifeless last week. So, yeah, James is going to project really well if you give him the full 19 touches per game. If you bring him down to 10 or 15, he is going to be dicey. At receiver, Tez Johnson, Evan Stewart, still very clearly the 1-2. It appears Holden's punishment is not quite over yet. And maybe it's just that him spitting on the defender. I forget what game that was off the top of my head. The big game. Ohio State, I think. Anyway, perhaps him spitting on the defender was just enough room to open up snaps for Justice Lowe. And Lowe has played really well. He's been at 64% of the routes, 78%, 69%. That was with Holden getting just 28% last game. Maybe Justice Lowe has just played well enough where he's holding off Holden right now. That should be a lesson to you youngsters. Don't spit on guys, get yourself suspended, and then allow highly recruited young players to come in there and outplay you. I don't know where this is going to come in, but I don't think you can click Holden right now because he effectively lost his receiver job by spitting on someone. At tight end, we might get Terrence Ferguson back. This is an appendectomy. I don't know a lot about this. I think it's kind of just like you play when the doctors say you can play, but maybe he won't have quite his full role. Kenyon Sadiq has been pretty good when he's gotten touches. Again, they've been murdering teams, primarily the Illinois game, so you didn't really need to do anything. Herbert is pretty vanilla as a tight end, so he can go right back to the bench. Not sure where they use Sadiq, though, with Ferguson back. A wait and see for me. I'd like to get a 1-game sample at least of Ferguson, snaps under his belt, see what they plan on doing. Davis Warren's going to play QB. Jack Tuttle quit. That's my hot take. Anyway, Warren is the best quarterback option they have for moving the offense. He's the best efficiency metrics. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not saying a lot. The best of these 3 is still pretty bad. He's certainly not live for DFS. Mullings, Edwards, if this game remains competitive, they have decent touch floors. I just don't know if that's going to be the case, especially with some of the defensive injuries. What I can say is Loveland has a 35% target share, even higher when you isolate the half a game he missed. You could play Loveland if you want, 4,800. He just has a gnarly target share. What's the scoring expectation should be your real question. Everyone else is in a pretty nasty rotation. I don't think Michigan has any other pass catchers you can reasonably consider. All right, are we to the FanDuel slate already? Yeah, we are. Okay, so that's the main slate. To the FanDuel slate, we have 6 extra games, I think. We have Arizona State taking on Oklahoma State. Sam Leavitt has been announced as the starter, so they've taken a ton of money. Arizona State, that is, 57 total. It's actually come down, which is weird because Arizona State 67th in pace, Oklahoma State 11th. Sam Leavitt back is great for the offense. For DFS, it's kind of negligible. He's a game manager. 25.5 attempts per game, 279 on the ground. It's just not really enough, even at 9,700 on FanDuel, to take a big stand on. And it's kind of the same on DraftKings. Cam Scatabo, he's back. Of course, he never missed any time. He was just on the injury report. He has a pretty gnarly touch ceiling when games are competitive, which this one projects to be 121 yards on the ground. Very good opportunity through the air when he's healthy. DeCarlos Brooks did return, which they can take a few carries away from Scatabo. I don't think they want to, but earlier this year, they were just so banged up that Scatabo kind of had to play every single snap. At wide receiver, Xavier Gulleroy missed their last game. It sounded like it was just some maintenance. The quote was like, we're holding him out to get him 100%. Could he play through this? Sure, but what's the cost? I think Gulleroy returns, but I don't think he threatens Tyson, who's very clearly the wide receiver one for this team. The other pass catchers could be debated. I'm not 100% sure where this comes in. Without Gulleroy, we did see Troy O'Meara jump to 100% of the routes, and I cannot tell you why. His previous high was 9%. He is a highly recruited Texas transfer, but previously he'd been behind Jake Smith. He'd been behind Melquan Stovall. I would tentatively think Gulleroy comes back and reclaims the wide receiver too, but there's enough volatility here where it's Tyson or pass. Maybe you play Shimon Mateer at tight end, but even he rotates a little bit. Bowman's back. He is taking sacks again, negative 23 yards on the ground. His efficiency has dropped rapidly to 265 yards per game. Just not really that interested in Bowman at this point, especially against an Arizona defense, which is underrated because of the injuries they've sustained. Bowman has been so bad this year. Ollie Gordon got hurt in their last game. He's questionable. I don't know what they do if he's out. They've actually been using Rodney Fields more than Sesi Vahahi in recent games. Rodney Fields at 5,500 would certainly be someone you could look at. If Ollie's out, even if Ollie's in, like 9K is still probably too expensive. He's been a disaster this year. His pass game role is pretty good, I'll say that. But man, what a fall off for Ollie Gordon. Just super sad to see. Reminiscent of the Chuba Hubbard fall off. So hopefully when he gets drafted, he resurges like Chuba has. At wide receiver, Brennan Presley, 17 target game. My goodness, I don't care. I would rather just go down and play Stribling, Owens, or Shetron. Big thing to watch here. Stribling never mentioned to have an injury, but then he only played about 20% of the routes last game. And their beat reporter noted he continued to get his ankle retaped over and over again despite not playing. So it looks like there's a little bit of an injury for Stribling. Watch his status if he's out. Shetron played almost every snap, and his absence would be, I think, just a one-for-one replacement right away. A&M South Carolina, 44 total. I don't know what FanDuel is jamming these horrible games on their main slate, but 3-point spread in favor of A&M. They're 113th in pace, 37% pass rate. South Carolina, 49th in pace with a 40.5% pass rate. Connor Wegman hits the bench. They won't name a starter. I think we all think it's Marcel Reed, who is infinitely better for DFS because his rushing ability is better than Wegman's. And Wegman only beats up teams that are bad, which South Carolina is not. They have one of the best defenses in the secondary, in the SEC, despite their offense being horrible. That's just it. I don't know if you really want to pay 9K for Marcel Reed because of the matchup. He does have a good floor ceiling combo if he achieves any passing success because he's giving you a good floor on the ground. Just a very tough matchup. This is like a 60-40 split in the backfield between Moss and Daniels. Having Reed in the lineup is worse than Wegman. More design carries will go to him. He immediately stepped in place of Wegman for 12. In the receiving game, Jade Walker is suspended for the first half with a targeting, which should narrow this receiving core at least a little bit. Noah Thomas is pretty clearly the wide receiver one, I think. And from there, I mean, Cyrus Allen, 52% of the routes. Jabari Barber, 70%. Jade Walker was already around 50% even before the targeting, so maybe he's even lower. Not very clear. Just kind of a bad situation all around. For me, it's either Noah Thomas at 55 or Barber at 54. I think those are pretty efficient price tags. Lenore Sellers, he's not running as much lately. I'm not sure why. His carries have dropped, 247 on the ground, not giving you anything through the air. Part of the reason is this is arguably the worst offensive line in the SEC. His receivers are downright horrible. It's negligent what they decided to come into the year with. Raheem Sanders at running back. We're seeing more guys involved, plus Sellers. I guess you could do worse. I'm not getting there, though. Not on either site. Receiver, they're getting back Jared Brown, which muddies the water even further. This team is an absolute disaster. No one's averaging more than 4 targets per game. Let's just go forward because we have a good game here. Clemson and Louisville with a 62 total, 10.5 point spread. Clemson has played nobody since their first game. So Louisville projected to give them a little test here. Louisville's taken money. Only 10.5 point spread. Very competitive. Decent in pace. 82nd in pace is Louisville. 52nd is Clemson. 55% pass rate for Louisville. Clemson, 51.5%. Tyler Shugg has regressed, but he's still averaging 293 through the air. He's more mobile than these 5 yards indicate. The O-line's just been bad. Losing Monroe Mills didn't help him for those period of games. So he has some rushing upside. I think he's a fine player at this price tag. The team total's not super low, so you could get to him. Just don't love the price on either site, really. At back, Isaac Brown has been leading a committee that gives Kewan Brown, Duke Watson, Donald Chaney some opportunities, but he's pretty clearly in the lead, and it's not all that close. He's third on the team in targets, too, so he's pretty insulated. I think you could get to him. I'd rather pay up, but you could do worse. At receiver, Colin Lacey hits the transfer portal. First game without him. Who knew? Ja'Cory Brooks still 10 targets. He's obviously your wide receiver 1. From there, we saw Chris Bell right back up to 95% of the routes. And they rotated everyone else. I thought Amari Huggins-Bruce was going to play a lot. He fumbled, so maybe that's why he didn't. 49% of the routes. Chris Hughes, 32%. Kadarius Hicks, 17%. Multiple tight ends. Mark Redmond, 75% of the routes. Season high for Redmond. Maybe that's just it. They'll use more 12. I don't know the answer. I do know that you either want to play Chris Bell or Brooks. Cade Klubnik is super expensive on FanDuel. And I mean, at this point, we need to give him the credit he deserves. He's averaging over 5 yards per carry. He's giving you 227 on the ground, 263 through the air. And plus, they've put the brakes on in a lot of their games because they've been absolutely kicking the snot out of teams. I would love more upside from the offense just as a whole, but you could play a contrarian Klubnik. He's not my favorite option. I like Maffa much more. When games are competitive, he's just going to absolutely stomp over these opponents. He's averaging 97.5 rushing yards per game. Very clear pass catcher. When they do throw, only 6 yards per game, but they haven't been throwing a lot to backs, nor have they needed to, but he's pretty efficiently priced. I think a little too cheap on both sides, just by a hair. At wide receiver, no Tyler Brown. Apparently, Bryant Wesco's back at practice. They've had a bye now, so we might see him. What we do know is that Brenningstool and Williams are the 2 most consistent pass catchers for this team right now, especially Brenningstool being insulated from like the Wesco stuff. At tight end, he's very clearly insulated. Antonio Williams, he's been above 70% of the routes in 3 straight. Troy Stillato's been above that in 2. TJ Moore, 68%, 56% last 2. I guess Bryant Wesco needs to be mentioned. He was at 86 and 60 before the injury. I don't know where he's going to come in now. Adam Randall above 35% in 2, but below 40. Cole Turner, 26 and 31. They're going to rotate without a doubt, but I do think Wesco hurts mainly Stellato and Moore. Perhaps he brings like Turner down a little bit, but the only player I see is truly insulated at wide receiver is Antonio Williams. I think I would rather just pay down for Brenningstool at 6,300, to be honest. USC Washington, 56 total, 2-point spread in favor of USC, the road team. Pace, USC 65th, Washington 88th. Pass rate, USC 61%, Washington 53.5. Miller Moss, no rushing, 282 per game. Actually, on the other side, Will Rogers, no rushing, 253 per game. Neither of them are strong price-adjusted plays. It's just the game environment that might get you there. I could see it, I guess. Woody Marks has an awesome role. 21.3 touches per game, 94 rushing yards, another 29 through the air for Woody Marks. He's averaging 4.6 targets per game. That is awesome. You could definitely play him. Jonah Coleman's not that far off. He's averaging 98 yards per game. His receptions have gone down recently, still 15.5 receiving yards per game, but that's on just 2.4 targets. He is really efficient. For whatever reason, they insist on giving Davis and Muhammad and these other guys carries once in a while. But Jonah Coleman is coming off a 20-touch game where no other running back, no other player on the team had more than 3 carries. So worth noting. At receiver, USC is a complete disaster right now. They're actually pretty talented. They're just rotating so many guys. I don't know how you predictably come into this last game, no one above 67% of the routes. That was Kyron Hudson. He was the only one above 60%. Branch and Lane, 59 and 56. Lemon, 48. Robinson, 29. McCree, 44. Ford, 44. Y, just Y. Jay Fair, nearly 19. Y, I guess margin of victory probably had something to do with it. But still, you never see anyone touch 80 for this team. No one has touched 80% of the routes in 3 straight games. Throw a dart on Branch, I guess. Throw a dart on Deuce. Throw a dart on the cheap guys if you want. For Washington, this is much more consistent. Boston and Jackson are your top 2. It's not even close. Jeremiah Hunter has recently played less, which is pretty defensible. He's been bad, which has meant a few more snaps for other players in this offense, largely Rashid Williams, but he has yet to fully carve out a role. It's still Jeremiah Hunter most of the time as the 3, which kind of just means I don't think you play him or Latu. Jackson, I think, is the best price adjusted play for Washington. All right, 2 more games for FanDuel. Kentucky, Tennessee, 45.5 total. Basically can't play anyone in Kentucky. They're 17.5 point underdogs. Implied team total is 14. Brock Vandegrift stinks. Demisumo Kongbai is back from his injury. Devontae Trainum is not. Who knows what the touches look like with Wilcox and Patterson being out there. They're playing Wimsat to run the ball sometimes too. Matchup is difficult. Just a mess. They're not playing their receivers full snaps, especially not Barry and Brown. Dane Key's probably the best guy to get to if you want to play anyone in Kentucky in the pass game. I'm not sure why that would be your inclination, but Dane Key, 100% of the routes. Barry and Brown, 83. Fred Ferrier, 21%. Yikes. Tennessee. Nico Iamaleava has horrific stats for DFS. Do not play him. I say that and then watch him just like smash with the 31.5 team total. I'll say this. He has a lot of talent and he's shown it against weak teams, but he's been horrible in the SEC. And I do think Kentucky's still better than that non-con they played. Dylan Sampson is not that though. He is averaging 22 touches per game and he has been above that in 4 straight games. 120 yards on the ground, another 12.5 through the air. He is very expensive, but playable still at this price tag. I would rather go down and play guys like Phil Maffa. But holy smokes, he is good. At wide receiver, these sites perpetually get Tennessee incorrect. FanDuel actually did a better job. I think Brew McCoy is not just pure dust over there because every time he's healthy, he leads his team in routes. So I'm partial to Brew McCoy. I think he's the most safe, I guess, the safest wide receiver for this team. Brazell, he did have a 74% route share last game. Squirrel White has not played more than 69% of the routes in any game. He's only been above 50% twice. And he's been hurt, but he wasn't hurt in all those games. And he was 3rd highest in routes on this team. So very messy outside of McCoy and Brazell, I guess. White would be 3rd, but yeah, I mean, White is not playable on FanDuel at this price. Last game, Pitt, SMU, 57.5 total. A little light, in my opinion. 7-point spread in favor of SMU. Pitt is 4th in pace. SMU is 28th. Pitt is passing 55% of the time. SMU at 41%. Eli Holstein at 10.8K is very expensive, but he has some mobility. 286 yards on the ground this year. He's averaging 258 through the air. This offense has struggled a little bit of late, so I have some concerns, especially at price. This is a very expensive QB. I'd rather just play Jennings on the other side. Des Reed, he's averaging 20 touches per game, and most of it is coming in the pass game. So you could play him as a contrarian piece. I think he's efficiently priced on both sides. A little better on FanDuel, in my opinion, compared to DK. And then receivers, kind of messy for this team. They will play 4 guys, mainly Mumfield, Williams, Johnson, Sincere Lee, with Bartholomew playing tight end. They're pretty cheap on FanDuel specifically, especially a guy like Mumfield at 67. I have some interest in playing him, but it's only 6.3 targets per game on the year. SMU, Jennings is officially priced on FanDuel, but what in the world is DraftKings doing for the 2nd straight week? What are the props doing on him? He's averaging 200 yards per game because he's split time with Preston Stone in a couple games this year. 321 rushing yards. The guy has absolutely smashed his passing props in 3 straight weeks, and I'm on him again over 217. Have him projected around 240. He's hurt, so that is the biggest pause I have. He's going to play through it. So aggravation, probably your biggest concern. We will see with Kevin Jennings, but I think he's an awesome play on DK. FanDuel, he is pretty appropriate. At running back, we just don't know what this team is going to do week in, week out. Fresh off an 8-carry game, Brashard Smith went out there and carried the ball 25 times. I think this was probably health related. Why else would they do this? That coincided with Roger Daniels, the receiver, dropping from 9 carries to 1. LJ Johnson has played a change of pace role in both of those games. I think they want Brashard Smith to be the lead back and Roderick to play more wide receiver, but what do I know? LJ Johnson will be a change of pace, but I think you can play Brashard. At receiver, tons of injuries. Brinson hasn't played in a month. RJ Maryland's out for the season. Jake Bailey got hurt in the last game. He's been in a non-contact jersey. That actually might consolidate Keyshawn Smith, Jordan Hudson, Roderick Daniels, and Moochie Dixon. If Jake Bailey's out, we just don't have any other pass catchers who've really played any snaps this year. At tight end, Matthew Hibner did come in and play almost all the routes. He was above 80%, so he'll fill in for Maryland. But then rather than rotating 6, it might be condensed to 4 with Smith, Hudson, Daniels, and Moochie Dixon. That would give me more interest, especially in a guy like Moochie Dixon at 4,900. His routes have pretty consistently been up above 50%. We'll have to watch and see the status of Bailey. That will do it for us, though. Last 2 games are DK night slate only. Won't get into that. Prize pools are really bad. If you have any questions, leave a comment below or reach out to me on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. Otherwise, we'll be back next week with more DFS. Until then, good luck. We'll see you later.